A recent poll asking Americans what they believe the biggest problem facing our country is reveals that 11% of Americans believe it's our economy. And I personally agree. Any of you who know me or have heard me speak before know that I'm incredibly pessimistic about the future of our country, especially from an economic perspective. And today I'd like to delve into one of the many reasons why. This is the reason I think is the most obvious to people, and everyone should be aware of it. Most people are aware of it, just not to the extent that it really is. I'm talking about our national debt. So what is a national debt? Essentially, it's money our government owes, whether it's to other countries or to our own people. Government has two primary ways of financing operations. They can collect taxes, or they can borrow money by selling treasuries. If any of you have investments in treasury bonds or treasury notes, that's money that the government has borrowed from you. You've loaned them money. It's not really an investment, it's more a loan. If we spend in more money than we take in any given period of time, we have a deficit. Deficits are rolled over into debt after we borrow the money to fund what we've spent. And our national debt is essentially the total of all of our deficits we've yet to pay off. So let's take a look at our national debt. According to the US debt clock here, we're sitting at just under $19 trillion in debt. It's quite a bit, huh? It's pretty bad. To the right, over here, this little debt per citizen ticker. How I said earlier, governments make money through borrowing and taxing? Yeah. So that means the way this debt gets paid off is with taxes. Every one of us technically owes the government $58,000 to pay down the money we've borrowed in their name, or they've borrowed in our name, depending on how you look at it. So we as citizens are personally liable, which is kind of terrifying to think about, but let's think about it in terms of the global perspective. What is $19 trillion? Is it a lot compared to other countries? Who knows? Well, let's take a look. We currently have a debt to GDP ratio of around 100%, maybe 101. Yeah. Meaning that the amount we owe, according to our national debt, is just about equal to the amount of stuff we produce in a given year, according to our GDP. Japan's sitting around 220% of GDP, Greece is around 175, so we aren't doing too bad, right? We can pay it off whenever we want to. Fine, but no, that's not how it works. First of all, we can't just use the entirety of our GDP to pay off debt. That's just not possible. It's not how it works. I'll probably do an explanation of GDP some other time, but it's irrelevant right now. Let's look at what we can do. Taxes. Yeah, we could raise taxes and pay off the debt. You know, just a little bit of pain right now to be debt-free in the future. You don't have to worry about it. Well, if we look at the historical record, regardless of the type of tax policy we have, regardless of the tax rates we have, income taxes are always fluctuating between 16 and 19% of GDP. Right now I think we're sitting at like 17-ish. And that's because people have choices. You know, if you raise tax rates on people, they're going to put their money into tax-exempt areas, municipal bonds, stuff like that. So obviously, history shows us we can't get more money by raising tax rates. So the solution is to increase GDP. Right? Am I right this time? 17% of 100 is more than 17% of 50. So if we keep taxes the same but make GDP larger, we'll be on the right track. We'll make more money. Correct. Hypothetically, that'll work, but unfortunately the math has been done and it's almost mathematically impossible to pay off our debt. There's a man by the name of Simon Black who released a video. It's about a half hour long. No, actually, I think it's an hour. Yeah, I think it's about an hour long, where he does a financial model of our national debt. He shows that we would need around 6% sustained GDP growth over 3 to 4 years to begin paying down our debt. And we would still be dealing with deficits for years while that was in place. In order to kill our deficits and begin reversing the trend of growing debt, we would need sustained 7% growth, he said. I'll put a link up to the video so any of you that are interested in this can go watch it for yourself. It's really interesting. if you're interested in finance and economics. So anyways, around 7% sustained growth for years. And this also assumes no rise in interest rates or changes in inflation, that's constant. Well, from the records I've found, we haven't hit 7% GDP growth since 1984. And even that was just the 1 year. Back in the 60s, we had a 3-year streak of around 6.5%, which would be great, put us on the right track. But the interest rates increased every single year from 3.85% to 4.32% and up to 5.76%. And inflation was on the rise as well. That's why they adjusted interest rates, because of inflation. Anyways, if you do end up watching Simon's modeling video, you'll see rates like that kill any chance of GDP growth helping us out. I mean, it completely cancels out the growth. And he actually goes into the mathematics of it. He has a financial model spreadsheet that he shows if you guys are interested in watching it. But luckily for us, we don't actually have to pay the debt off. Not right away, at least. We just make interest payments, I don't want to say it's like a credit card, because national debt isn't like a credit card, but you make interest payments on a credit card. You don't necessarily have to pay down the principal, but it's a stupid thing to do. We can do the same thing. Currently, the interest paid on national debt's around 1% of GDP, which is nothing, right? I mean, we just said income taxes are 17%, so we can spare 1% to throwing money at debt, especially if we start paying down the principal. Debt gets smaller, we pay less, everyone wins. Unfortunately, that's not happening. It's not going to happen. I have here, for your benefit, the White House forecast of annual government outlays for defense spending, non-defense discretionary spending, and interest on the national debt. According to the White House, not me being biased or playing with numbers or anything, according to the White House, by 2021, interest will surpass defense spending, which many people think is already too high. I mean, if you hate how much we're spending on the military, imagine doubling it, and half of it isn't even doing anything to benefit our country. And by 2022, it will surpass discretionary spending. And by 2025, it'll be 3% of GDP. Is that sustainable? I don't know, maybe 3% for a little while, but the fact that we're seeing it increase instead of decrease means eventually, unless we change something significantly, it's going to hit an unsustainable level. Again, unfortunately, it gets worse than that. Let's go back to the debt clock. So, down at the bottom, right in the middle, this little box, it says U.S. unfunded liabilities. What does that mean? Well, an unfunded liability is any obligation where required future payment exceeds the available funds in current dollars. So basically, they're government promised payouts, which have nothing backing them up, nothing. There's no debt. The plan is that when a point in time comes that the money for these things will be needed, more treasuries will be sold, more debt will be taken on to pay for them. So they're not worried about how to pay for them right now. They're saying, we can always finance them later on. We have $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities. How does that make you feel? Probably not too good. Doesn't make me feel good either. That's a little less than $1 million, $840,000 of liability for each and every taxpayer in the country. We are on a path to failure, people. This is unsustainable. It's unsustainable. But, unfortunately, again, gets worse. I have here a report entitled America's Fiscal Insolvency and Its Generational Consequences. It was testimony to the Senate Budget Committee in February of 2015 by Professor Lawrence Kotlikoff of Boston University. He's an economics professor. Along with the financial modeling video, I'll put up a link to this report as well if you guys want to read it. It's only about 12 pages. It's a quick read, but I'm just going to read a few important excerpts out of it. So, right here, opening statement. Our country is broke. It's not broke in 75 years or 50 years or 25 years or 10 years. It's broke today. Indeed, it may well be in worse financial shape than any developed country, including Greece. So, it's very dramatic intro. He goes on to say that there are almost $750 billion in government collections this year from workers under the heading Social Security payroll taxes and future Social Security transfer payments these contributions secure. The $750 billion could just as well be called government borrowing, and the future transfer payments could just as well be called principal plus interest on this borrowing, plus a future tax if the future payments don't correspond precisely to principal plus interest. This simple change in language would more than double this year's reported federal deficit. We were to go back in time and relabel all past Social Security taxes as borrowing. Official federal debt held by the public would not be $13 trillion, because this was back in February, so, the debt wasn't quite as bad. But $38 trillion, which is 211% of GDP, so let's just let that sink in for you guys for a second. $38 trillion, folks, 211% of GDP, almost as bad as Japan. Why aren't these numbers being released? Why don't people know this? How can the government not put this on their balance sheet? If anyone else were to do this, it would be accounting fraud. But because they're the government, they're not subject to the laws they make. It's disgusting. They just play with words so they don't have to inform people about this. And it's shameful. And it gets worse. He goes on to talk about Treasury bond payments and Social Security payments. Despite the identical nature of their appearance, only the present value of the Treasury bond payments is included as part of government debt. The present value of the Social Security payments is not. Why is that? Yes, the Treasury bonds bear the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, but those fancy legal words don't make those bonds safe in any real economic sense. Our government has periodically defaulted on the real value of official debt by running inflation. In 1946, for example, it wiped out a quarter of the real value of war bonds by lifting price controls. In the 1970s, our government used inflation to wipe out hundreds of billions of dollars in the real value of federal debt. So we'll get into talking about inflation and how it's used to get rid of debt. I have a little bit more of this report I want to read, but there's just a couple things for you to look into if you're curious about the government not paying its debt in the past. So he goes on to talk about his fiscal gap calculation. The infinite horizon fiscal gap tells us whether the government has over time enough receipts to cover its projected spending equals the present value of all projected future expenditures less the present value of all projected future receipts. He then goes into listing 5 properties he considers important that make the fiscal gap calculation valid. I'll provide a link to this if you want to read them. I'm not going to go into them right now, but turn the page. So he explains why fiscal gap is important, and then he gives us the number. You guys ready to hear how much the government really owes or will owe, given all of the plans they have in place right now? The U.S. fiscal gap currently stands at $210 trillion. 16 times larger than the official U.S. debt. This fiscal gap is 12 years of GDP, including projected growth. 12 years of taking everything we have and throwing it at this problem, which we've already established we can't do. And he goes on to say that the way to close this gap is an immediate 58% increase in federal taxes. 58%, guys. Not just for the rich, everyone. Every single person in America would need a 58% increase on the amount of taxes they're paying. He's basically saying the government only has access to 42% of the money it needs to finance its operations and projected future operations, but not projected future operations that they might instate, ones that have already been promised to people today. Social Security payments, Medicaid payments, Medicare payments, all of these things that you believe you're entitled to and you think you're going to get in the future, the government doesn't even have half the money they've promised you. Another option would be an immediate and permanent cut in federal spending of 38%. I'm all for that. He then goes on and projects on the next page what would happen if we waited until 2025 to close the gap. Remember I said earlier, the White House projects interest on our debt will be 3% of GDP. If we wait until then, we would need to increase taxes by 64.4% or cut spending by 40.4%. So, not only is the government doing things wrong policy-wise, it financially can't afford the few good policies it is enacting. There's no solution to this problem, people. The government will default on its debt. It's happened before. They've inflated away debt before. Russia's defaulted on their debt before. Puerto Rico is about to default on their debt or they're going to be bailed out. Look into what happened in the Weimar Republic in Germany. Civilized governments default on their debt. It's only a matter of time. And all we can hope for is that we still have a few years so that we can prepare. I mean, it's hopefully people can figure out this is happening and they can prepare themselves so it doesn't all come crashing down on them. I personally think that the petrodollar system, which if you don't know what that is, I'm planning on making a video about it in the future, and our status as the default international reserve currency are the only things keeping us above water right now. They're the only things. And both of those systems are already on the way out. They're being, I don't want to say attacked, but other places are working on replacing them. I mean, people are sick of having to buy oil in US dollars. It's totally understandable. Anyway, so let's talk about what will actually happen if the government does default. If they default on their foreign debt, it's going to cause an immediate and catastrophic global banking crisis. If you guys thought the whole 0708 thing was bad, Jesus, this is going to be so much worse. But there's another option, which is the option a lot of people say, oh, this is why it's not a big deal, because we owe the money to ourselves. No, that's why it is a big deal. The Federal Reserve owns a few $1 trillion in treasury bonds, and if the government were to default on anyone, I think it would be them. Obviously, we don't want our central bank to become insolvent. I mean, looking back to 2008, it happened in Iceland, and there were terrible results. Just go Google, economy of Iceland '08 or banking '08 in Iceland, or maybe I'll do a video on it some other time. So we hope they're not going to do that. But even if they did, the Fed could continue printing money like it has been, quantitative easing, and inflate away the debt. Anyone who understands basic economics knows that if you increase supply enough, value drops unless there's, increase in demand to make up for it. The Fed's already doubled the amount of money in circulation in the past 10 years, and given that a rise in interest rates means a rise in interest payments, I'm assuming that sometime next year they're going to roll out another quantitative easing session and print more money. Devaluing our currency makes it easier to pay your debt. If I owe you $100,000, it's a nominal $100,000 now. If I can print so much money that $100,000 is now, value-wise only worth 60, doesn't matter. I'm giving you less value, but it's still the same nominal amount. So it's cheaper for me to pay it off. And I mean, every government does, but we have a fiat currency. Currency only has value because people believe that it does. People believe that our government can support it. But as we saw, as I read to you in that report, the government's inflated away debt before. And the government doesn't have enough money to fund themselves. So if this happens, if they decide to inflate everything away, it's going to destroy your savings. The money you have sitting in your bank account, the $200,000, $300,000 you thought you were going to retire on, could end up being worth a fraction of it. I mean, it's happened. Again, look in the Weimar Republic. They were printing billion-dollar marks. You'd walk into a grocery store, buy a carton of eggs for 10 marks. The next day you'd come in, it'd be 1,000 marks. It happened. It would basically be a tax on people holding US dollars. And like I said before, this is our debt. As a taxpayer, this is money we owe. It's what happens when you give the government permission to just do whatever they want with your money. There's no way around this. It's going to happen. And I'm not telling you this to try to scare you. I mean, you should be kind of scared, but I'm not trying to scare you. I'm not trying to sell you anything and fear-mongering or anything. I want you guys to know so you can be prepared when it happens. There are things you can do to lessen the blow, Don't just sit on cash. Invest in real assets, real estate, commodities, foreign stocks and currencies. But, try to look into countries doing better than we are. And there are plenty out there to choose from. Myself personally, I've been moving a lot of my money into gold and silver, which I do want to do another video about why I think those are good investments right now. Southeast Asian markets, I've been moving a lot of my money into the Hong Kong market, and emerging South American countries. South America, parts of South America are doing really well right now. Chile, for example, is doing wonderfully. Also, vote for people with solid economic policies. Nothing, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think anything they could do could stop it, but they could make it not quite as bad, which would be helpful, obviously. Share this information with people, especially people who plan on voting for someone like Bernie Sanders, who's promising billions and billions of dollars of free stuff to people. I don't know how we can justify that, but, people don't understand that there's no such thing as free. It has to be paid for eventually. Either we're going to pay for it in a few years, or your children are going to have to pay for it years and years down the road. There's no such thing as a free lunch. That's one of those old cliches that the older I get, the more I realize how true it is. But there's still time. I don't know how much. Some people are thinking this year, 2016, what bank was it? I forget the bank that did it, but there was some bank that they're projecting a 65% recession this year. I'm a little more optimistic. I think maybe there will be a market correction this year, but I don't think there will be a collapse. I think we got 3 years, 3 to 5 years, but then again, timing the market is a really difficult thing to do. I hope this has been eye-opening for you. I hope you choose to follow economics a little more closely when it comes to your political opinions. I hope that you pick your votes wisely, because we're all in this together, and we need to drastically change how our government handles economic issues. Thanks for listening, guys. Till next time.